Yes. And we're going to go ahead and start. So again, good afternoon, and thank you for joining part 2 of the Network's Advocacy Workshop. For those who do not know me, my name is Trudy Morgan, and I'm the Policy Director of New York State Network for Youth Success. The Network for Youth Success, for those who do not know about us, is the statewide after-school network for New York, working with 49 other state after-school networks and the After-School Alliance. We are committed to strengthening the capacity and commitment of communities, programs, and professionals to increase access to high-quality programs and services beyond the traditional classroom. We are also the state affiliate for the National After-School Association and the New York State lead for the National Girls Collaborative Project, and the backbone agency for the New York State Community Schools Network. We would also like to hear from you. And so please take a moment to introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining us from today in the chat box. I'm going to take a second. Right. We have folks from the Capital Region where we are based, Wayne County, New York City. Awesome. I know this is going to keep coming, so I'm going to go ahead and continue. And so today's workshop builds on our first workshop, for those of you who were able to attend, which looked at the basics of advocacy in the after-school space. We learned about the after-school advocacy landscape and ways to get involved in after-school advocacy, gained an understanding of advocacy and how it differs from lobbying, and got to hear more about the network's advocacy goals and efforts moving into the next fiscal year. I encourage you to view the recording of the first part in the case you were not able to join us last week. Today's workshop will provide an overview of strategies critical to effective advocacy. We will look at some strategies to develop an advocacy plan, demonstrate effective messaging through our Power 3 campaign, which we talked about last time, and also introduce a model to effectively frame and communicate your message. Absolutely feel free to drop questions in the chat box as they arise, and we will do our best to answer them during the presentation today. And if we're not able to get to them, we will share them out, the responses to that via email. And we are also going to follow up with a PowerPoint slides and additional resources, just as we did last time as well. These advocacy workshops are part of the Power 3, which is a public awareness campaign on the role, benefits, and impact of after school. These workshops also align with our Power 3 Ambassadors program, which is a free advocacy leadership program that helps after-school professionals and supporters develop advocacy and media skills to become effective advocates. Now, as we discussed in our previous workshop, advocacy is about educating or informing about a topic. And as you well know, there are many issues that come before our decision makers. Therefore, it's really important to employ strategies that help you make a case for your cause and helps our collective efforts to ensure that legislators are prioritizing after-school issues. Effective advocacy involves knowing what you want, how it has to be said, and knowing how to say it to who has to hear it. And these 3 pillars are what we are going to be talking about today. And so the first pillar, which looks at knowing what you want, encompasses developing an advocacy plan. This actually often happens in the back end of many organizations involved in advocacy, such as the network. And so when you see an email to call your legislator or join us in the tweet storm, these activities are part of a plan to ensure that we amplify our after-school priorities. But these steps are crucial for your own individual and local advocacy efforts. That's why we're talking about them today. The truth is we can hold a workshop or 2 on each of the items I'm going to talk about. Since those who do deep advocacy work and research engage in extensive actions related to this, like those who do the job related to this. But what we are providing at this workshop is just an overview. And so as we think about it through that lens, that this is just an overview. And so what are some things to consider, right, when developing an advocacy plan? Well, a couple of things. Firstly, you need to know what your advocacy goal is. Advocacy often comes about when there's an issue that needs attention, such as when there's a lack of something or too much of something that needs to be changed. To begin defining your goal, you may ask yourself, what is the issue you've identified? Why do you think it is important to address this issue? What is the solution to the issue you identified? How much time do you have to address the issue? Will you be lobbying as part of the advocacy? And if you will be, what will be your call to action? And when I talk about a call to action, it is an invitation to take a desired action or exhortation to provoke some form of action. You absolutely have to be clear about what your advocacy goal is, because how you define your goal will steer the other steps you have to consider when developing your plan. The next step is to identify those who have a stake in the issue you're trying to address through advocacy, or who will care about or be impacted by the issue. These are your stakeholders. Now, here's a question for you. Who do you think you can engage as a stakeholder in after-school advocacy? And you can use the chat box to communicate as well. So I see Cindy says school administration team, community leaders, and parents, for sure. Local community leaders, parents, donors, exactly. Yes. Any other thoughts? I see parents here as well. Absolutely. Absolutely. As you've actually reiterated, for after-school advocacy, there's a wide range of stakeholders you can partner with. So as has already been mentioned, students, parents, community members, educators, business community, nonprofits and universities, and a whole lot that has already been put in the chat as well. So for example, a parent might be interested in after-school advocacy because they want to keep their children safe when they're working. A business might want after-school funding because they agree that it helps provide important workforce skills. Now, even though all these stakeholders will care about after-school, it is critical to understand their different interests in after-school and leverage them in your advocacy efforts. That's really important. Now, this is also true for your targets. Who are the people you want to influence or educate about your issue? These are not only entities who have the authority or power to address your issue, but also those that can influence those with the authority or power to achieve your advocacy goal. And so here's another question for you. What are some entities you think you could target in after-school advocacy? You can also put your responses in the chat box as well. So I see community partners, elected officials, rightfully so, government officials, legislators, foundations, press, politicians, for sure, for sure. Thank you so much for your participation in these responses. And yes, you're all actually very correct, right? A key point to remember here is that your stakeholders and targets can be similar depending on what your advocacy issue is about and how you go about your advocacy. When we engage in grassroots advocacy and lobbying, for example, you find that many of the individuals we consider stakeholders, like parents and students and all the other folks you mentioned, are also targets because they can have significant influence on how legislators and other decision makers design policies and allocate funds. Now, the operative word here is their level of influence. And so while a student can be considered a stakeholder, a student advocate can be a target for the purposes of after-school advocacy. Before I move on, I want to stop to see if there are any questions. Okay. So the next step to consider is your messaging and communication. What is the key message you are trying to convey? And how are you going to communicate these messages? Now, key messages are often short, sweet, and concise because it is the takeaway headline you want your audience to hear, understand, and remember. Developing talking points to help you communicate your key message is also important for several reasons. Firstly, it helps you and those involved in advocacy communicate the same message with one voice. These talking points can also pique the interest of your targets, especially if one or a few resonates with them. Actually, in a few minutes, we will shift gears to share a simple model that can help you frame your individual message. Something to note here is that an effective key message connects the issue and advocacy goals in a credible manner. As a matter of fact, one key message from our advocacy, after-school advocacy, I like very much, is give kids an advantage, fund after school. So for those who are not familiar, Advantage after-school program is one of the funding streams from the state. So it's short, sweet, concise. Now, the next step is to outline the tactics and activities you would employ to sustain your advocacy. How are you going to coordinate these tactics? Do these tactics help all your stakeholders engage in advocacy? These are some of the questions you ask yourself. And I know during our last workshop, we actually looked at some of these tactics. And then the final step here is to know your timeline. That is when or till when you will implement your advocacy strategy. Now, if you've been involved in the network's advocacy efforts, you'll see that we employ a couple of the tactics that has been outlined in the current slide. Now, my advice is always to employ a few tactics you can strongly execute rather than utilizing many tactics you cannot do well. And so after you have figured out your advocacy goals, stakeholders and targets, messaging, tactics, and timeline, you're ready to advocate. But another important note here is that this plan can be amended depending on the trajectory of the politics and development related to the issue, right? And so I'm going to take another pause here to see if there are any questions. And let me take a look at the chat box as well. Are there any questions? Okay, so now we're going to focus on the messaging part of the advocacy plan a bit further by demonstrating the network's messaging through the Power 3 campaign. As has already been mentioned, our Power 3 campaign aims to educate New York residents and their elected officials on the benefits of after-school, summer, and expanded learning opportunities. And one question we often get asked is, what is the Power 3 o'clock? Now, I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well. What do you think Power 3 means for after school? Why do you think we call it that? And please feel free to add your responses in the chat box. Okay, so I see June says starts at 3 for 3 hours after school. Great. It tells when the programs are happening and that they have powerful impact on children. Thank you, Dana. All right, Kara, so 3 o'clock after school time. Great, so this is really great. It sounds like many of you know you're very well versed with what this could mean. Thank you so much. So you are all right. The Paris 3 campaign focuses on the next 3 hours of a student's experience after the school day ends, which is normally at 3 p.m., and elevates how the 3 different types of expanded learning opportunities, that is after school, summer, and other expanded learning programs, benefit young people and their families in 3 main ways, which we are going to go over shortly. And so right here, you see a coordinated pattern of messaging that helps make our case for after school, right? Very catchy. So our advocacy, as I mentioned earlier, really revolves around the core messages highlighting the benefits of after school. That after school keeps children safe, supports academic achievement and development, and helps caregivers balance work and family. As trusted partners, after school, summer, and expanded learning programs have long provided a safe space and environment for children to be cared for and high quality supplemental education to mitigate learning loss, while helping caregivers balance work and family. And these programs enable parents and guardians to stay focused at work, knowing that their young children are cared for. This is something that we all are very familiar with working in the field. And we also know that they provide protective factors against risky behavior such as substance abuse and misuse through the development of protective or resiliency factors, including school connectedness, self-management, self-awareness, and quality peer relationships, all of which we know help students keep engaged, learn, and then thrive. Now, these key messages can be a starting point in your own advocacy conversations about after school. So again, going back, that after school keeps children safe, supports academic achievement and development, and helps caregivers balance work and families. And for reference, we actually have put together talking points. This was from last year's advocacy that we just put in the chat, which you can use as a starting point for your own conversations on after school. We absolutely encourage you to share your own experiences to amplify our Power 3 messaging and specify it to your community. Interestingly, actually, one way you get your target to connect to your message is how you tell it. And making your case through storytelling and advocacy is a way to bring your advocacy plan, which we just talked about, especially the key message and talking points, to life and fruition. So I'm also going to pose another question. Why do you think storytelling is important in advocacy? And again, feel free to use the chat box. Thank you, Dana. Right on point. Everyone has a story and we relate to each other's stories. Exactly. Any further thoughts? Absolutely, Cindy. It humanizes the issue, gives the public an opportunity to see behind the scenes and the importance of after-school programming. Exactly. And then Christine says, it's how we relate the story that helps those outside of this world understand the need. Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you all very much for those responses. It's right on. So just to add on to what has already been said, there are a couple of reasons why it is an opportunity to connect with representatives. As was already mentioned, legislators are always looking to hear from their constituents, and being able to share something that is beyond facts and figures can help you as an advocate understand their interest or focus, and then leverage empathetic connections. We know that oftentimes numbers can be overwhelming and they sometimes actually turn off empathy, but stories and personal connection turn it on. And people are more likely to support when they have emotional connection to a cause. After all, decision makers are also human. That's what I often tell people. And then moreover, this gives you an opportunity to not tell, but show the resources and services you provide or receive as an after-school stakeholder to change outcomes. Legislators are always keen to know how the resource they support, advocate for, allocate, are utilized, as much as how that resource transforms a student or a parent's life. So they're really interested in seeing both sides of the equation. And of course, storytelling is also a great way to engage your stakeholders in advocacy. There are so many individuals who are not professional lobbyists, and many of us are not, and they might not be comfortable with sharing technical information on an issue, not even speaking in public. But storytelling, right, can put those individuals at ease when it comes to educating decision makers about after school. And then perhaps more importantly, storytelling, as someone mentioned, helps bring diverse perspectives and experiences to the forefront, right? Providing an opportunity to represent and or amplify voices that sometimes have been historically marginalized. And so to develop our stories for advocacy, we share a very simple model, a self, us, now model. And if you look carefully at the design of our advocacy toolkits, you will see that the messaging follows this model. This model was originally developed by a Harvard professor, and it actually allows speakers to tell their stories by identifying individual values and experiences that motivate them to care about an issue, connecting them to those values and experiences that motivate their community to care about an issue, and then rallying others through a call to action. We talked about a call to action early on when we were looking at advocacy plan in response to challenge or in response to the challenge or threat. And so we're going to actually go through an example to see how this works. So this is an example of us using the self, us, now model. So self, it says, after school is important to me because it helps me stay focused at work, knowing that my child is safe. And connecting it to the community, it says, after school should be important to us because as parents, we want to be able to balance life and work without having to forego the benefits of one because of the challenges that arise in the other. And so if we want after school to remain funded, and this is the now, excuse me. And so if we want after school to remain funded, we need to call our legislators right now and ask them for an additional $20 million to fund after school programs in Orchard City. Now I'm just going to take a pause here and ask, what stands out to you in this example? And feel free to put it in the chat. And if you'd like to also meet yourself to respond, please feel free to do that as well. Are there any thoughts, comments? I see Dana says it only talks about one topic, not everyone at once. It's short and sweet and well connected. Free. Based on this, from what perspective do you think this is coming from? Who is the stakeholder in this example, would you say? Yes, parents, for sure. So again, thank you for the participation. It is clear in this example that it's a parent's perspective and utilizing some of these talking points and messaging around the importance of after school. And yes, Kelly says she appreciates how it goes beyond one individual person to the collective. Absolutely. The connection piece is really critical. Thank you. And so we're actually going to look at a second example in the next slide, a little bit longer. So the self says 20 minutes before I head out to pick up my 7-year-old son, Johnny, from school, I get a call from my supervisor to cover for another colleague at the hospital. Should I answer the call? All I have is 20 minutes to make new arrangements with my friends to see who can pick up Johnny. who can pick Johnny up and take care of him while I'm working. I have 20 minutes to choose between work and my child. But enrolling Johnny, that's a tongue twister, in the after school program just about 10 minutes away changed this for me. And then in the us, I know that many working families, especially caregivers on on-call jobs like mine, know this dilemma too well. Without having the support and confidence that our kids can be safely cared for, many of us choose to stay at home and take care of our kids. And then now, finding a safe space for my Johnny to be cared for while I cared for others has made a difference for our family. And I know that this is also true for those working parents that benefit from after school. And so join me in calling our legislators right now to ask them for an additional $20 million to fund after school programs in Orchard City. Now, I'd like to ask the same question again. What stands out to you in this example? Jim here says, it told the story. Thank you. Any further thoughts? Dana says, it's a very specific story about one parent, but includes experiences of other parents. Thank you. Ali says, the details provided can easily relate. Great story for social media too, exactly. So based on example 1 and example 2, which of these stories would you, if it were you as a decision maker, would you feel more connected to or impacted by? And if so, if there's one or the other, why do you feel you'd be connected to one more than the other? Dana talking about the timeliness with frontline workers and COVID, yes. Any further thoughts? I want to make sure we don't lose anyone. Yes. Okay, Ali says for her, example 2, because of the specific story, exactly. Do folks feel that way too, that example 2, perhaps? Exactly. So obviously it's by design that we presented 2 different examples for you to look at. And Christine, yes, so Christine actually is looking at where maybe either or approach can be used. So first one with donors, second one could be used for social media with a broader audience. Yeah, that could be the case. Importance of looking at which fits where, for sure. Thank you again very much for your participation and engagement in this. And so you'd see that, while the second example follows the self-as model, self-as now model as well, you see how the second one strengthens the impact of this story by showing and not telling. So that's one of the big differences. Because as you read this parent, or as you hear or read this parent story, you can imagine what it means to wake up at 7, having just 20 minutes, calling your friends. And that's the difference between example 1 and example 2. Obviously, it's longer. It might take a few seconds if you were talking with a decision maker and you were showing rather than telling your story. But I always encourage advocates who use this model to show rather than tell, because as you've all, as the consensus has been built, it actually helps to connect even further with the people you're talking with when you're showing than telling. So that's the key lesson here. But Christine also made a really good point, right? That depending on who your audience is, or depending on the capacity within which you have to share your story, you might need to use the abridged version because you might not have a long time to share some of the details. But even in all, as much as you can show rather than tell, helps in terms of impacting the people who hear your story. And so we actually have a worksheet to guide you in developing your story. And this is also something that will be shared in the chat box, but also after our PowerPoint presentation as well. And so I'm going to stop here and ask again if there are any questions and comments or thoughts based on what we've talked about today. And again, feel free to use the chat box or unmute yourself to share if you'd prefer that instead too. Okay, so I see in the chat box, advocacy resources available on the website. Yes, they are, June, and we'd be happy to share the link to that as well in our follow-up. I would say though, our resources specifically related to the budget season, the updates to that are forthcoming. So it might be the case that some of the information you find are not the most updated, but we do have a link for you to be able to look at. Good question, thanks for asking. Does anyone else have a question? All right. So this actually brings us to the conclusion of what we wanted to talk about today. And so to recap, we presented an overview of effective strategies to advocacy by discussing steps to develop an advocacy plan. And then we demonstrated effective messaging through our Power 3 campaign. And then we talked about the self-ask now model as an effective way to frame and communicate your message. And so I would like to thank you all for joining us today. And if you want to stay up to date and to find opportunities to engage in our advocacy efforts, I highly encourage you to sign up for our Power 3 listserv if you are not already connected through that. Because this is a way we actually share our calls for engagement with the field and also new research on after school to help inform your own advocacy efforts. Especially with the budget season coming up too, a lot of our communications are going to be through our Power 3 listserv. So highly encourage you to sign up for that, as well as folks in your network to sign up for that. And if you're interested in taking a more in-depth hands-on approach to after-school advocacy, then we encourage you to review our Power 3 Ambassadors program. Unfortunately, the deadline ended yesterday. However, after going through these workshops, if you feel like you really would love to get deeper, please reach out to myself or any of the network staff about more information on how to apply, and we can provide you more information on that. We can provide more information on that for you. We also want to share that afterschoolmeals.org has information about getting reimbursed for serving healthy suppers and snacks through the Child and Adult Care Food Program. And so if you have any questions related to that or anything we talked about today or on after school advocacy, please feel free to reach out to myself or Gabby or Ali or Kelly or anyone from the, or Giovanni, anyone from the policy team as well. And so with that, if there are no questions, really want to thank you for joining us. I hope this was a good experience for you, and we will actually be following up to with a quick survey to inform us about how we can better serve you, especially when it comes to policy and advocacy. Thank you so much for joining us today.